It's been kind of an interesting weekend. I kind of got to go to the Hopkinton Fair yesterday, so it was pretty neat to kind of get to do that after not getting to do it in a while. And my goodness, what a perfect day. Gorgeous, gorgeous day. And it's, it's kind of, fairs are kind of a funny thing in the sense that kind of once you've been, you kind of seen the stuff, but you still seem to enjoy it a great deal. It's still really kind of great to be there. And I know that kind of after a year of COVID, or a year and a half of COVID at this point, it was really neat to get to do something I hadn't been able to do in a while. And so being outside and kind of being out there, just really, really had a nice time with that. And it made me start thinking a bit about, one of the things that happened during COVID is that we all kind of fell into this, I'll call it a groove, of just kind of, each day was kind of a lot the same. So we kind of got up, we got through the day. Hey, getting through the day is a good thing. You go to bed, and you start again the next day, and you get through the day. And the thing is that I think that COVID shined a spotlight on that kind of getting through the day thing, but I think if we're not careful, life is like that a lot. That life is busy, and let's be real, life is hard. Whether it's work stuff, whether it's family stuff, the kind of the things that come along. And what ends up happening is that if we're not careful, every day becomes, get up, man, I got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this. And then day's over again. And we got through the day, and that's a good thing, and we do it again tomorrow. And so, obviously, that's not something we want to do, because if we're not careful, day after day becomes week after week, month after month, year after year, and all of a sudden a bunch of time has gone by, and you realize all you've done is get by. And we don't want to do that if we can help it. And to be honest, I noticed a point in my life where that was starting to happen to me. And so I thought about, how can I do that? How can I break that cycle that I find myself in? And so what I decided to do at one point, and this is a few years ago, I decided that I was going to look for key demarcations in my life. Things like anniversaries. Okay, a year has gone by, or some period of time has gone by. Let's stop for a second, and let's just think about how we got here. And I actually started doing that with each new year as well. Now, I'm not really a New Year's resolution guy. I'm not saying they're bad things. Just not a thing for me. But what I like to do is actually get to the end of the year, or actually as I start the new year, and I look back to the year. And I say, wow, what are the good things that happened? And make sure I appreciate those good things, because we lose sight of the good things. So make sure I appreciate those. But also reflect back on what didn't quite go the way I'd like it to. I won't say it went wrong. I'll trust that there's a path to it. But it certainly wasn't what I would have liked to have done. And see what I can learn from those experiences. And what that allows me to do then is to then look at the year ahead and say, well, how can I adjust? How can I do it differently this year? How can I get more of those things that were things I want to celebrate and less of those things that I would like to learn from? I'd like to learn a lot less in this year, sort of thing, or have to learn a lot less in the upcoming year. And then try to kind of plan that as a kind of a future path and see how I can kind of build the future I want by doing that sort of thing. So, as we talked about, I just had my first anniversary at this church about 2 weeks ago. And so for me, this is a big demarcation. And so, I wanted to kind of take that time and do what I just described. Look back and look forward. And I will tell you that as I looked back, the number one thing that I felt was gratitude. Far and away. That's what I felt more than anything. Gratitude for being here. As the sun comes out, by the way, I will point out, as I mentioned gratitude. So gratitude was the number one thing I felt for being here, for you guys trusting me in this role. But then also all the individual experiences I had, all the conversations I had with people, the things people were willing to share with me, things people were willing to tell me and talk to me about. And that led, again, to just an overwhelming feeling of gratitude. And as I continued to kind of look back, I also kind of reflected back on the call process, which is that kind of, for us, was like close to 5 months or so leading up to when I accepted the position and the church accepted me. And there was a lot of great conversations in that as well. A lot of great conversations with the search team, but also great conversations with the conference leaders that we associate with in the church. And one of the things that really stood out to me as I look back on those conversations was something that came up multiple times. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it came up with every person or team that I talked to, which was making sure I understand the importance of being connected to the community it is for this church. How important it is for this church to be connected to the community. And was I willing to invest into that? Was I willing to commit to that truth, that this is a community church, and do what it takes to develop that role as a community church? Now, for me, fortunately, that was an easy one. The answer is absolutely yes, because I am convinced, I am absolutely convinced that the local church is the hope of mankind. That if we're going to make life better in this country, in this state, in this town, in this region, the local church is at the heart of that. But as I thought about what does it mean to be a community church in the 21st century? Because we are actually in the 21st year of the 21st century. Now, this is a church that's been here 250 years. Next year will be 250 years since this church was officially founded. And the meaning of community church has never really changed, in the sense that the meaning is you do what it takes to care for your community and to connect with your community. But well into the 20th century, did I say the 21st year of the 21st century? Did I say that? Sorry. It is the 21st century, right? It's 2000s, but it's still the 21st century. That's one of those confusing things, right? Right? It is the 21st century, so I'm not wrong, I'm just doubting myself. I'm always right, so I should never doubt myself. And you hear from my wife when I say that, right? Yeah. But what I thought about is that it's always meant the same thing, but what it looks like has changed. Certainly over 250 years, it's changed, but over the past 10 years, it has changed dramatically. The role of churches, I shouldn't say the role of churches, the way church is executed effectively has changed dramatically in the past 10 years. Honestly, it's changed dramatically in the past 18 months. I mean, I wouldn't have had this here 2 years ago. But this is how we connect with the folks who can't get here. And maybe we should have had it here sooner, but we have it here now. So if the folks who have health issues can't be here, people who aren't comfortable coming out are now here with us each Sunday morning as we go through. So important things have come from that. But what I wanted to do is that as we kind of look at this demarcation, kind of heading into our second year together, I wanted to really think about what it means to be effective in our role as a community church. So today we're starting a new series that I've called Community Matters. And it's meant to be a play on words, that community certainly does matter, but also what are the things we need to attend to be deeply connected in our community? Because we have to really answer that question. We really need to identify what we need to do to more deeply and increasingly effectively connect to our community. And what I find sometimes is that when I start out with what do I need to do, and I find myself just kind of making a list of things I need to do, I've kind of had to learn to step back from that. It can be very easy to run into and battle one task and then another task and another task, because it's kind of the natural thing that draws us in. And when I find myself doing that, I try to stop myself. And I try to step back and try to find the bigger question. What is the overarching way we need to approach things? In other words, what kind of philosophy do we need to have? How do we think about things? Because if we can actually step back and decide how we want to think about things, deciding what to do gets a lot easier. Because if we don't step back and think about how we want to think about things, there could be things that are good ideas that don't feel like good ideas, and there might be things that feel like good ideas that aren't good ideas because we don't know what we're measuring them against. So the key thing I think to always do is to say, let's define what we want to measure our actions against. And that then guides our actions. So that's what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks, is kind of the overarching philosophy, and then look at some things that I think are key to kind of achieving that philosophy, to, again, continuing to evolve and grow our role in the community. So here in part one, I want to talk about two are better than one. Now, as I go through the message, you'll see why I chose that name. But this message is actually driven by one of my favorite quotes in the New Testament, and actually made by one of my favorite people from the New Testament. Now, he has a good name, so that's not a bad thing. James, the brother of Jesus. Right? My name's Jim. See the connection? You guys get that? Right? Come on. Right. So make sure you're keeping up. Just make sure you're keeping up. Although my name is not actually James, so anyway. But James, the brother of Jesus. There are more than one James in the New Testament, but James, the brother of Jesus. I love James because James was not like a lot of the other apostles and disciples. He came to faith later. He didn't believe in Jesus when Jesus was alive. He didn't believe into him until after he died and was resurrected. And James actually is a man of few words. He doesn't speak a lot of fluff. He says what needs to be said. He says it really directly. There's never a question about what James is thinking, ever. Because we have some examples of the way James communicates. We have what we call the book of James, which is a letter he wrote to some churches that is really direct about the way he thinks the church should function. But we also have information from the book of Acts, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. And the thing that's important to remember, the book of Acts is documentation of the early church. The book of Acts starts with Jesus ascending to heaven, and then it follows the decades after that, and what the church went through, and the decisions the church made, and the things the church saw happen, and the things the church dealt with. And what we're going to look at today is everyone's favorite thing to do, a church meeting. It's actually one of the first administrative meetings of the church. And this has happened because there's some things going on in the church. And so the biggest players in the church all show up for this meeting. All the people you know. The Apostle Paul is at this meeting. The Apostle Peter is at this meeting. James is at this meeting, as well as a whole bunch of other church leaders. And they've come together because they're starting to feel stress as a church. That unifying feel that they had in the very beginning is beginning to wobble. And people aren't feeling as unified as they once did. Because things are changing, because the church is growing. And this kind of very common set of kind of backgrounds that all the people in the early church had, the church is now growing out to people with different backgrounds. And things are starting to change. And this change is leading to some really serious disagreements. And a bunch of really strong opinions are coming out. And people are arguing. And everybody's saying how they think it should go. And everybody's saying what they think should be done. And we're going to jump to the end of the meeting, and then we'll fill in what happened before it. We jump to the end of the meeting because at the end of the meeting, James says one thing that ends all the argument. The statement that James makes as he sat there quietly watching all the arguments around him, watching fingers wagging at each other, people standing up, yelling at each other. I'm making that part up. We don't actually know that. But we do know they were really unhappy. We know for sure that they were really unhappy with each other. So he waits for all that to die down. Never raises his voice. He just waits till they run out of things to say. And then James says this: my judgment is that we should not make it difficult for these Gentiles who are turning to God. Now, seems simple enough. And on the surface, it is simple. I mean, why would we want to make things difficult for anyone who is turning to God? But what can be a very simple idea can become very complex in the details. Because what was happening in this meeting is that a bunch of proposals about the way church should work were being made. And these proposals that were going on were the results of really good intentions, things that people really thought were important, traditions that people thought were really, really important. And they were important for them. But they were becoming barriers to other people. That the thing we have to understand, there was one unifying factor in the very earliest of church, starting with the people who became believers while Jesus was there, and those first, probably, decade and a half after that. Do you know what they had in common? They'd all grown up Jewish. What's so important for us to remember, in the early church, the people who became Jesus followers never saw themselves as converting. They didn't think that they had grown up Jewish and converted to be a Christian. They never saw it that way. They had grown up in the Jewish tradition. The Jewish tradition included a promised Messiah. Jesus showed up. He's the Messiah. To them, this was the fulfillment of the Jewish faith. They were still Jewish. They were just Jews who believed in the Messiah. But, so because of that, they had all had this common tradition. But then things started to change. The church, as it began to grow, people started going out talking to people in the surrounding region. The Apostle Paul is the most famous of those, but many people were going out talking to people in the surrounding region. Those people were not Jews. They were Gentiles. All a Gentile is someone who's not a Jew. So they're teaching about Jesus to these non-Jews. And these people are becoming Jesus followers. They're being saved. They're saved by grace. They're embracing the teaching of Jesus, which is that you are saved through faith, forgiven through faith, and they were becoming Jesus followers. And people like the Apostle Paul and others were seeing this as a huge success. But many of the Jewish Christians did not see it that way. They were seeing it as being done wrong. That is not the way church works. Because they don't understand. They need to know these traditions. They need to know this background. So the Jewish Christians were very focused on the fact that you can't just jump to the end like that. You can't just start talking about faith and Jesus. No, they got to know all this other stuff before they believe that. But that was creating tension. Because you now had two distinct views of the right way to be a Christian. And this is what led to the disagreements, and this is what led to that meeting, because the church was actually on the edge, or I would say at the beginnings of being torn apart. That they were beginning to become these two separate ideas. And it was not just kind of, we disagree a little bit. It was actually beginning to reach a point where it could tear the church apart. And that's why this meeting came along. Now, at the beginning of the meeting, there's this one group of people who actually make the point clearly as they see the problem. So what we have from the meeting is this. Some of the believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees stood up and insisted the Gentile converts must be circumcised and required to follow the law of Moses. Now, when we see the name Pharisees, we know in the Gospels as we go through the life of Jesus, we see the Pharisees a lot. And the Pharisees look like they're villains in the Gospels. They're constantly opposing Jesus. But the Pharisees are not villains. The Pharisees are just very devout Jews. They'd grown up Jews. They were deeply studied in Judaism. And some of them may have lost their way and were pursuing political power, but not all of them. And some of those Pharisees became Jesus followers. They believed his teachings. But for them, their Jewish traditions were a key part of their identity. And for them, those Jewish traditions were the on-ramp to faith, to becoming a Jesus follower. Now, although that's their traditions are creating a barrier. Why is it a barrier? Well, let's go to the first one, circumcision. How's that going to do for our adult males joining the church if we make that a requirement to come to church? Oh, come on, that's funny, people. Come on. That's funny. Come on. I mean, we'd have an all-female church is pretty much what we would guarantee. Some people might say that's a good thing. I get it. But it's certainly going to be a big barrier to men coming to church. But also the law of Moses. I mean, there's a lot in the law of Moses. You know, there are some things that are really challenging, but, eating kosher, is that bad? I mean, kosher is a reasonably healthy way to eat. Taking the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath from sundown Friday to Saturday, that's actually not a bad way to live. It's actually kind of good for you. So why were they barriers? Well, because to these Gentile Christians, they weren't meaningful. They didn't understand why they mattered. For the Jewish traditions, for the Jewish Christians, this was incredibly important. It connected them to God. For the Gentiles, it just felt burdensome and pointless, meaningless. Doesn't mean it was meaningless, but it felt that way to them. So what the Pharisees were proposing seemed quite reasonable. Well, if they don't understand why those traditions are important, let's create some classes. Right? Let's go ahead and start some classes. And so if you want to be a Jesus follower, every Saturday for the next 5 years, we're going to have a 4-hour class so you can become a Jesus follower because you need to learn all these traditions first. Well, they wouldn't be a Saturday. Actually, if they were Jew, it would be a Sunday. But anyway, that's kind of what they were proposing, that the problem was not the traditions. The problem was people just didn't understand the traditions. So we need to teach them the traditions. And although that sounds reasonable, that was not the approach endorsed by the key church leaders. It was certainly not the approach endorsed by Paul. Keep in mind, Paul was a Pharisee, and he actually looked at those traditions and said, no, they are too burdensome, and Jesus frees us from that burden. So he'd been out teaching all along. In fact, he was probably the chief offender, saying that you didn't need to follow those traditions. Salvation is by grace. Jesus saves us through faith. That's what he was teaching. We know that James doesn't agree because we've already seen what James has to say about it. And even Peter, one of the very first apostles, doesn't agree because it turns out that Peter was the very first of the apostles to actually share the message of Jesus with Gentiles. So Peter had actually seen people who had no attachment to these traditions hear the message of Jesus, embrace the message of Jesus, and he saw evidence of their salvation. Because what he says to everyone in the meeting is this: God knows people's hearts, and he confirmed that he accepts Gentiles by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did us. He made no distance between us and them, for he cleansed their hearts through faith. And then he makes his key statement. We believe that we are all saved the same way, by the undeserved grace of our Lord Jesus. In other words, again, I've seen it. People came up to me and said, I want to know more about this Jesus thing you guys are doing. And I felt God led me to tell them that it was about grace and faith, and that Jesus had already done the work. And if you accept that and embrace that, that's salvation. They did, and Peter saw miraculous change in those people's lives. So Peter reminds them of that important role that faith has in all this. And it would certainly seem that Peter has made the key statement to kind of shut down the Pharisees' arguments, that there's no need for those traditions because I've seen God do a great work without those. Now, if Peter has made that point, it seems that he has said all that needs to be said about shutting down this movement to start making all new Christians start out in the Jewish traditions. So if Peter has already said that, if he's already shut down that issue that we don't need to do it that way, why does James bother to speak? Because we know that James never spoke unless he needed to. He always sat by, didn't get involved unless he needed to get involved. So if that's his personality, why does he bother to speak up? Because remember that he sits there all that time, and then after Peter says this, he says, I don't think we should make it difficult for those who are turning to God. The reason he said that is because he's thinking about it in a different way than Peter is. Remember that Peter was an impulsive person, where James seems to be a much more reserved person. So as the Pharisees raised these issues, Peter says, oh, I have a story that will shut down that issue. And he did that, and he did a good job of it. But James didn't look at it that way. James was like, man, the church is still really young. In fact, at the point of this meeting, the church has only existed for about 15 to 20 years. And James is looking at this as like, well, wait a minute. If we're fighting about this now, what's going to happen in another 20 years? What's going to happen in another 100 years? I mean, I have no idea how long James thought the church would be around, but he knew it was going to be around for a while. So he says, we can't fight these issues one by one. What we need to do is have a guiding philosophy so we don't keep having these kinds of arguments. And so he makes the point that we shouldn't make it difficult. Now he says Gentiles, but I think what he probably meant is we should make it difficult for anyone who's turning to God. So James reinforces this point that the Jewish traditions weren't necessary. But he's also reinforcing another point. But if the Jewish traditions are what connect you to God, then they're a good thing. It's what works for you. As long as we are doctrinally sound around salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, the rest of it's kind of what works for you. And something that's really important to remember. James grew up Jewish. James was Jewish throughout his adult life. And as far as we can tell, James lived out his Jewish traditions through his entire life. So he never declared them bad. He simply said that not everyone has to follow them. And that was the point that he was making. So what James did in that one meeting, that early meeting, is he set a key standard for the church. A standard of peace, unity, and inclusion. That there are foundational doctrines that we live by, but everything beyond that, there's some things to talk about. There's room for disagreement there that doesn't have to be disagreement. It's simply what works for you, as long as we stay keyed in on those key things. So now, what does that have to do with being a 21st century community church? Well, I think it had something to do with being a first century church, a second century church, all the way up to a 21st century church. But in terms of being a community church, a church that is committed to reaching the community around it, what this whole little interaction shows us is that experiences that create comfort for some create barriers for others. And so, if we are called to be a church that does not create barriers, we need to function in a way that people who have different needs about church can find what they need. Because the thing we have to remember is that we're all going to connect with God in different ways. So to effectively connect with our community, we need to provide those mechanisms. And so that's why over these past few months, you've heard me mention it here and there, is that in the new year, we're going to move from one church service to two. And I want to be really clear. We're moving from one to two. We're not just adding another one. We're going to actually look at the way we do our church format. And each service is going to have its own structure and its own format. Now, as I've mentioned that, I've gotten a lot of questions, and that's a good thing. And I've heard a number of different questions, but I think I could probably boil them down to two questions. The first question I've heard a lot, and again, this is a really good question, is that, look around. Does this room look full to you? It ain't full. Why do we need another one? Fill this one up first. It's a good question. It's a really good question. The other one is, well, if what we're doing in this service isn't connecting with enough people, well, just adjust what we're doing. Won't that connect with more people? Both really, really good questions. And questions I struggled with before I started talking about this more broadly. But I think if I kind of describe where we're at, where we're going, and the way I see the purpose of Sunday morning, but I think it's probably the way we all see the purpose of Sunday morning, I think it kind of answers both questions. I mean, first of all, what's the purpose of our Sunday morning service? My hope is that it's not your only connection with God during the week. My hope is what prepares you for your week. My hope is that throughout the week you're praying regularly. My hope is that you're engaging with the Word of God in some way, either reading your Bibles, or if you put the Bible app on your phone, you can actually listen to the Bible. You want to listen to podcasts, read spiritual books. My hope is that all those things are part of your lives. And so our goal here is what you've heard me say before. Our goal here is to be the locker room, that thing that kind of gets you ready for the week, that kind of helps you strip away the weight and pain of the week that's gone by, and reconnect with God, to head into a week more energized and more ready to kind of walk in your connection with God, more ready to walk in your connection with the people around you. That's the purpose of church, is to come together and connect in an engaging worship experience that sets the tone for your week ahead. That's our goal here. So understanding that, it's important to understand that, the next thing that's important to understand is that the worship experience in the 21st century, broadly speaking, breaks down into two broad categories. One category is what I'll call the traditional worshiper. That's what a lot of folks here are, is that you probably grew up in church, you've been around church your whole life, and familiar things are what give you comfort. Repeating structure is what gives you comfort. You want to say the Lord's Prayer each week. Reciting the creed, like the Apostles' Creed, is something that might give you comfort, that sort of thing. From a musical standpoint, hymns that you have heard your whole life and you want to sing along with is what gives you comfort. For a traditional worshiper, you generally engage most deeply with God through structure and familiarity. But then there's someone who desires a more modern worship experience. And the thing that's really important, and I can't say this strongly enough, that experience is almost the polar opposite of the traditional worship experience. That's a person who tends to like more progressive praise music, sometimes really hard charging music. And for a person who prefers that worship experience, sometimes they want to sing, sometimes they want to just close their eyes and just let the music flow over them. It's a very different experience. And the thing that's really important to understand is for that person, in general, they're going to prefer less structure. They actually like it to change up from week to week. They like things that blow out of the box and do something different. And so, if you look at those realities, the difference in those two styles is so significant, it is virtually impossible to blend them in an effective way. Because what you end up with is what I call a medium heat style. You got a little bit of a simmer going there. It's not quite as hot as I'd like, but it's okay. It's okay. And we don't want to be okay. What we want to do is we want to connect you with God. We want to connect people around us with God. And we want to give people that experience that gives them that connection. And the thing that I want to say, the thing I want to say really clearly, I am not saying that either experience is the right experience or the wrong experience, because there is no right and wrong answer to that question. The thing is that, again, as long as the fundamental doctrine is sound, it's whatever works for you, whatever connects you. So that's why when we go into the new year, we're going to have two services. A traditional service, and we're going to go back and look at those traditional elements and bring them in and actually put that together in a way that creates that experience with those familiar elements, those things that you're looking for. Go with that kind of pure hymn format. Bring those sort of things back for the people who want that. But if you prefer a more modern experience, we are going to architect that out. We are going to bring in a very different kind of music, very different styles, very different style of worship, and bring that all together. And each service will have its own feel, its own structure, and its own flavor. But what will not be different is the foundation of our Christianity. It will be the exact same message preached in both services. And we will preach the gospel in both services. We're simply going to wrap that in an experience that helps each kind of worshiper connect. And if you're someone who says that, well, I like both kinds, then come to both of them. Right? The idea is that we want to do that as a community church, it's what we need to do in order to meet the need that's in front of us right now. Because think about it. If you're a traditionalist, you're missing things right now. There's things that you had in church your whole life that you're not finding right now. Let's bring those back. If you've got friends that are traditionalists, then you can feel more comfortable inviting them to come to church with you because they're going to find the things that they expect. But if you're someone who likes that more modern experience, you're missing things because you're not finding the things that you're looking for in church. And if you have friends that are looking for that more modern experience, you can feel comfortable inviting them again. And the thing that we also know is that people who do not have a relationship with God tend to connect with the more modern experiences. So we need to have both to meet that full gambit of needs. those who are here and those who are not here yet. So that's what we'll be doing as we head into the weeks ahead. Again, it'll be in the new year. We don't have all the details worked out. We don't have an exact date for the switchover yet. It will be very early in the year. Probably sometime in the first 3 months of the year we'll do that. We don't have times and that stuff worked out. But that's what we're going to do, because I believe that's how we better serve everyone involved. So what does that mean for all of you? Tell me what you want. This is your chance. If there's something that's missing that you want to see, tell me what it is. Because there is no desire to make things, it just sounds stupid as I say it out loud. It sounded good in my head. To make things easier on me. I will do whatever work it takes to create these experiences that meet what you're looking for. But if you don't tell me, I don't know. I grew up in a traditional church. I like modern worship now. I've been in both sides of this. So I just need you to tell me what you want, and we will do it. We will, if we can do it, we will do it. I can't promise that I can answer every single thing people ask me, but anything I hear of commonality across people, I will do my very best to bring together. Because we are one community. Sure, we may experience certain things differently, but we are one community, and we need to stand in community, and we need to connect with our community. We need to do things in a way that empower us to connect with our community.